Today we have a special word of mouth, and we're going to be talking about Marshall McLuhan for the next hour, hearing special lectures that he has given. And today I have two special guests, Bob Marshall and someone who will remain anonymous. Take it away, gentlemen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen listeners. This evening I'm in dialogue with the Chief Archivist of the Marshall McLuhan Center at Toronto, Mr. Bob Marshall. May I, on behalf of our listeners, say that we have been looking forward to tonight's sharing of ignorance, Bob. Business at the beginning of the show. Of course, no show of less than an hour could ever explain any one person, let alone Professor Dr. McLuhan. To tame tonight's Herculean task is merely to say that we intend to play for our listeners and students as much of McLuhan in dialogue as is possible. Parenthetically, students are reminded to ignore everything but the hidden ground of perception so important to the work of Professor McLuhan.
In short, nothing we say or play during this hour will be as significant as the fact we're using the medium of radio at this time. The simplest and quickest way to summarize Marshall's approach used in his 22 books and 522 articles and essays would be to point out that it was based primarily on one part of the traditional classical curriculum of the 7 arts, which consisted of rhetoric, grammar, dialectic or logic, music, astronomy, arithmetic, and geometry. Marshall studied rhetoric at Cambridge in the 1930s, rhetoric being the art of the effects of spoken language, and since he regarded man and all his activities as language, applied rhetorical knowledge to the new languages which were man's technological environments. In the process of this study, he used the psychiatric technique of the suspended judgment in a kind of corporate psychiatry of whole populations and peoples during their interactions with these massive environments. However, on page 273 of the Gutenberg Galaxy, he reveals that, quote, a few decades hence, it will be easy to describe the revolution in human perception and motivation that resulted from beholding the new mosaic mesh of the TV image. Today, it is futile to discuss it at all, unquote. This was written in 1962, so it should be realized that Marshall had at least 20 years to play with his study of media and their audiences, and that's why he satirized the global audience of this revolution and its effects, including his own audience, as a parallel activity among many in his global theater role as the director of the Center for Culture and Technology. Okay, Chris, let's play.
Well, at the speed of light, there is no time or space. You have just space-time. And literally, when the telegraph came in, the space and time intervals between peoples were pulled out. That was shortly followed by Cubism, which pulled out the space intervals in painting. And the visual connections in painting were pulled out by the Cubists. I'm always insisting upon the artist as the sort of heralds of technological change. And as a matter of fact, we've worked on this quite a bit. Art in general gives you about a generation, at least a generation of warning or notice in advance of technological change. The art forms themselves will take on characteristics that really belong to something that has not been invented yet or hasn't surfaced yet. Seurat and Rouault were painting television long before television. The Seurat pointillism uses little dots, on discontinuous dots, with light dots, with light coming through the picture at you. And that's 1880, long before TV. And in general, the Cubists were not that far ahead of the telegraph, that's sure. But symbolism, which also pulls out the connections in poetry, was certainly part of the telegraph. Because the instantaneous forms of communication that came into the telegraph permitted a sort of simultaneous acoustic character, and it was exactly that which Edgar Allan Poe, the Southerner, latched onto in poetry. Poe became the sort of avant-garde of French symbolism. Baudelaire was the first to really understand Poe and to adapt him to French use. But Poe, the Southerner, the oral tradition man, is as significant a figure from that point of view as anybody. Another peculiarity from the South in that regard is, of course, that rock and roll and jazz all come out of the Deep South and could not possibly have come from Boston or Chicago. because there's no oral tradition there to hold them up. Jazz and rock are acoustic forms that do not depend on a written culture. And where there is no oral tradition, and there is no oral tradition in the industrial North, where there's no oral tradition, there is no basis for jazz or rock. But that's another subject. That's a hidden, but what I'm drawing attention to here is that there's a hidden ground that makes possible any technological change.
Well, I think we'll take it momentarily from there. Certainly, Bob McLuhan believed that the role of the artist is to keep people tuned to the present. And if you're going to tune their sensibilities, then you have to constantly rearrange the focusing of their perceptions.
Yes. How's it sound to you, Chris?
Well, guys, I was trying to fix some things here. I can't really... I missed that first one. I'll have to continue.
The message.
All right, let's continue.
Let's continue.
There's another factor, hidden factor in music, that the sounds of the environment are filtered through the language in order to create music. What is called music, whether it's Italian, German, or others, is the sounds of the human environment, technological sounds of the environment, being filtered through the language or transformed in the language. The language is the metamorphic power that creates music. So you can't, if German music is closely related to the German language, French to the French language, English music to the English language, rock and roll and jazz cannot be sung in any other language except English. In China, they learn English in order to sing rock. And English is being learned around the world by people who like to sing jazz and rock. But you cannot sing jazz or rock in French or Chinese or Finnish or any other language.
Well, I find a contradiction there. If he's saying that you can't, that if English is a literary and a linear language, how can you apply it to rock, which is an oral experience? Wouldn't non-linear languages like Chinese or Japanese be better suited to rock music in his definition?
Well,
I think you've sort of taken a twofold attack to the problem. I don't know if I would interpret what he's saying in exactly the way you interpreted it. What he's basically has said is that there is a great relationship between the word and music, and that what happens is there's latent within the language all the various musics, and they're just waiting for some new technology to release them.
Well, the thing about English is the only language that's measured in feet, and so it has the rhythms of tactility, and that's the appropriate language for rock, I would say, because it's measured in feet.
The important thing there that he said earlier that perhaps we can just start off with is that jazz and rock, as he said, comes only out of the oral tradition areas of the countries, and so jazz and rock come from the southern United States and could not come from Pennsylvania or New York or the northern literate cultures.
And these rhythms of the South mime the rhythms of the electric environment, which are oral in effect. The English language is very tactile, but I think it's the fact that metric rhythms through tradition were measured in feet. An iambic pentameter gave its advantage over other languages. If you're thinking of the concepts implicit in the Eastern languages that are effects of the rhythms of those languages, then the concepts might be more appropriate, but those languages are not as danceable as English. So English came out of passed through a literate environment.
One of the other topics that I'm going to be concentrating the most on tonight, Chris, is the true nature of electric technology and what it means to us, because McLuhan spent a lot of time talking about the meaning of electric technology, and basically one of the most important meanings of it is that everything happens simultaneously, and therefore what emerges is a pattern. And this is something that doesn't happen in a pre-electric age, because things don't happen simultaneously, and it's once you enter the electric age, moving out of the old mechanical age, that data classification yields to pattern recognition, which is the famous motto at IBM, under information overload conditions.
Well, in short, electricity is simultaneity, whereas previous mechanical environments were sequential.
And this has to do with the human brain, which those two areas are done in different different sections of the brain.
Yeah, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. For many years, before they came up with the terms left hemisphere, right hemisphere, in class, McLuhan would call the left hemisphere the eye and the right hemisphere the ear for many years before they came up with the terms left and right. And it was true, the left hemisphere did eventually, was the name given to what was the eye, and the right hemisphere given to what was the side dominated by the ear.
So what McLuhan is really dealing with is how the new technologies have to shift brain function and how society changes after that.
Sensory ratios and our mental set.
Our inner and outer faculties are all influenced. The brain is the inner faculties.
To get on with the tape, momentarily coming up, we're going to just get into a point that I think is very important also to make off the top of the show, and that is that McLuhan's entire approach to media was one of observation and percept and no concept, which links in with this left hemisphere, right hemisphere. McLuhan was right hemisphere in his perception and his apprehension of reality, and so he wasn't interested in concepts, but strictly in observing and reporting what he observed for his students' further introspection.
Well, I think that's because ideas are obsolete in the electric environment, and so he stressed percept, not concept, because ideas are rampant in the sense of obsolescence, meaning everywhere and quite obvious and quite available. But in a world of ideas, how does one get a grasp on that? And he terms that perceptual approach.
So he's saying that the hidden ground, that all art forms really resonate from hidden grounds that are there in depth all the time. That all the possible musics are latent in the English language. All the possible music for our world. And the same for the Chinese or any other linguistic group. That they're all latent in the acoustic forms of the language itself and are just waiting for some new technology to release them. Anyway, that's Kroeber, and it is very close to what I have done in the laws of the media. Well, this, you can see, though, that the thing we're talking about in terms of the alphabet is a pretty big subject and untouched. For some reason or other, psychologists refuse to examine visual space or acoustic space. There is nothing in any psychology book on the subject. They will not examine them. Now, why? They obviously have a phobia. No, I mean to say there's a reluctance. They shy away from this thing. It's so obvious, you know. You'd think that visual space would be something studied by scientists. No, not at all. But visual space is the only continuous connected space. You think that you're in a visual space here. Actually, there's very little visual space in this room. It's nearly all kinetic or acoustic or multi-sensuous. But the visual, the lineal and connected, of course, relates to the walls, the flat planes, and so on, and the feeling. But visual space is the only space that is connected and continuous and static. By the way, visual space is also static, Euclidean. That is the only kind of space that has those properties is visual. And acoustic space, likewise, is shunned by the psychologists. When you touch something, you create an interval, not a connection. That's resonant. When you touch anything, you create a resonant interval. If you press down, that's kinetic. That's not touch. Tactile space is interval. And that's the area that you can tune. You say you have a fine touch. You can tune that. You can't, when you press down hard, you can't tune the kinetic. It's not acoustic. But touch is acoustic interval. If there were any connection between my finger and that book, I would not have a finger. The book would be part of my finger, so wave it around. But the Anyway, this is basic. Because all the senses have unique spaces related to them. And therefore, if you want to understand your sensory life, you have to know the kinds of space that they manifest. And obviously the space of dreams is not visual or acoustic necessarily. It's a mix of senses. It's kinetic, and the space of the movies is totally different from the space of television. Television has no visual space related to it at all. It's acoustic, audio tactile. But that's one for Tony Schwartz to explain to you. He has a whole book on it called The Responsive Chord. Tony Schwartz, The Responsive Chord, page 14. He explains why the TV uses the eye as an ear and not as an eye. TV uses the eye as an ear. TV is not a visual experience. It's acoustic. And it's an inner trip.
Well, maybe you guys can explain that for them. How is watching TV not visual? Basically,
well, this, first of all, it's important, just before I let Bob go on, to say this would take volumes to elucidate. But so whatever terms we use have to sort of sum up some very, very large issues of study.
There will be aphoristic. But the main characteristic of television, which makes it different from movies, is the simultaneity of it. When a group is watching a movie, they're the only people watching it. But when people are involved with television, it's an environment that everybody can have access to immediately. So the distinguishing characteristic is simultaneity. And simultaneity creates depth involvement, whereas visual space is connected and sequential.
So the effect of television is on the individual watcher, not the fact that there's a million people watching it.
That's true, but in watching television, Chris, our eyes function like our ears in that they never see a picture, just as our ears never hear a word. The eye receives a few dots of light during each successive millisecond and sends these impulses to the brain, and so it's very much resonant interval in that we must have vibration to hear, and likewise there must be acoustic tactile touch. The omnipresent eye, and in conjunction with the ear, makes it a tactile medium because it's the interaction of the senses.
Well, I don't see how this is any different than seeing anything. It's your eyes don't tell you what it is. Your brain decodes what it is. What the TV signal does, you're right, is that it forms a picture. You never see a complete picture at once, as you would from a frame of film. But what I'm saying is the effect of TV is on the individual's brain. And if there is a group, if there's a simultaneity, it's not the fact that the group of people are watching it all at the same time. It's the fact that that you are locked in watching the thing at that moment.
Well, isn't the fact that we're on the air now, and anybody can tune in on this station, and also many other stations are going, this environment is continually active around the clock.
Yeah, but the more important effect is the fact that that we are inside the people's heads talking to them, that they are listening, and if they're not, it's not the group.
We are
the most effective part of the medium. This is what I think the medium is. The message is the fact that using a particular technology changes the way your brain is wired, and if you continue to use it, and this is why I think kids shouldn't watch TV when they're young. It's because it sets up neural pathways that are only used, and it takes a great effort to break out of that neural pathway and have a freedom of brain function, which I think is what consciousness-raising groups are about. So for me, the medium is a message in terms of brain function, is that the channel between your eye and the parts of the brain that decode the TV signal, those are more important than any content through the through your neurons.
Well, if you would save your children from the effect of TV, they're still dealing with a population, huge population that is involved in the electric environment, and your child will have to deal with the effects on them, so she will be indirectly affected anyways.
Yeah, they'll have to compete with that. But that is the decision. As long as people know that is what will happen from watching TV, then they can choose from there. But right now, everyone's being conditioned or not, depending if they watch TV or depending on which. If they read more books, they will be trained literarily, and that it's up to the parents to decide if they want a TV kid or a book kid, right?
But it's not just TV. The economic world is using the computer now for the last 20 years. Now this is affecting economics, which affects everybody. So we have inflation. When you move something speed of light, that creates inflation in all activities, especially the dollar or any currency. So it's not just the television. That's just one of the electrical extensions. It's the electric environment in total action, which is in a way a form of propaganda, not the messages, but the whole use of electricity in all facets of life, which affects all of us.
One thing, Chris, and that is that it's not a matter of debatable interpretation, but it is a matter of fact proven by the RCA Labs, the head of RCA Labs in the 50s, Krugman, who proved that the sensory effect of television from brainwave studies is totally the opposite of the effect of the film. Film is not light through on dots, it is light on a screen, whereas in television, you are the screen. And this is something that, again, is a very, very deep part of the study of and the work supporting McLuhan's theories done by other people at the universities who have it would take a lot more time to get into it. I think to some degree that's something that we must say is the information is available and understandable if you wish to take the time.
And that test was in the 70s, early 70s, not the 50s.
Yeah.
So let's continue with the tape.
Our sensory lives are very much involved in space. By the way, Einstein's space-time, Einstein had a lot of trouble with his own theory because he was always trying to visualize that which is non-visualizable. Space-time means that all space and measurement is related to the speed of light. Relativity means that all measurement of space and time is by the yardstick of the speed of light. And he had great trouble because he was a very visual man in some ways, and he had great trouble seeing the proofs of his own theory. He got a lot of help from artists and others. But relativity could only have come in the electric age. That's because we now live at the speed of light. That is a fact worth keeping in mind, that we now live at the speed of light. Our ordinary communications, whether by telephone or TV or radio, are all instantaneous.
I'll tell you what's alive and what you're not paying any attention to, and that's the satellite environment. The classroom is not having any influence on you. The satellite environment is having a profound influence on you and your being here this afternoon.
Sure, great.
But you know why?
Why can't we spend more time with the environment
with the satellite?
sitting there?
Do you know what the satellite does to you?
Oh, tell me.
As an environment?
What?
When it goes around the planet?
There.
It's a proscenium arch. It turns the planet into a stage. It makes you want to be an actor. Do your thing. Everybody now wants to do his thing since 1957 when Sputnik went up. And ever since that satellite arch went around the planet ceased to be nature. What we used to call nature is gone. The planet is now contained inside a human box. There is no more nature. What remains is simply whatever we make of this planet by programming. There's no nature anymore. The only people who use the word progress are developers. When you hear the word progress, you know you're dealing with a 19th century mind. The progress literally stopped with electricity because you now have everything at once. You don't move on from one thing at a time to the next thing. You have everything. There's no more history. It's all here. It's all here, though. All the past. There isn't any part of the past that isn't with us, thanks to electricity. But now, it's not thanks to print. It's not thanks to photography. It's thanks to electricity. Speed. Huge speed up means there's no more past. Now, there is no oral history, but your teachers and your parents have no belief whatever in identity or the goals of our society. They just go on through the notions. No, they don't believe in them themselves.
But I think
That's why you
world is an old-fashioned world.
It is. But you accuse the schools of still imposing them. I'm saying that those who run our schools and our society have no belief in the society they're running. They agree with you.
Where, in the subconscious?
No, at all levels.
Yeah.
The reason that it isn't so in being a rebel today is that everybody agrees with you.
I tell you.
I agree that we all find, that Marshall McLuhan here is a very interesting person, and like a lot of us came because we wanted to, hear his point of view.
I am not expressing my point of view.
Well, some of your ideas.
I'm analyzing a process, and I heartily disagree with it. I mean, my personal feelings about it are absolute detestation. And I never express my point of view on any subject.
Why not?
Because I'm interested in understanding processes.
He wants to be a catalyst in the real...
No, not necessarily a catalyst, but I am interested in understanding processes. And I understand what's making you tick and what's making you unhappy, but I do not approve of or endorse any of the changes that are causing you to feel this way. I call there is a point of view, and if the world is changing very rapidly, you can't have a point of view.
But I'm saying...
A point of view depends upon fixity. No, it's only an illusion in an electric world. When things are moving very fast, you can't have a stationary position or target.
Maybe you guys can explain what he means by living at the speed of light.
Well, all our communications right now between us and the listener is at the speed of light, and all the communications pretty well, telephone, telegraph, and all electric technology means that we now live at the speed of light.
Isn't it the speed of electricity?
The speed of electricity is the speed of light. And
That means simultaneity.
which is simultaneous, instantaneous, which is acoustic and not visual. But I don't want to get derailed. I just wanted to get back to that. The other point about the electricity is that when you do live at the speed of light, it means that with the telephone and telegraph, we are now, and radio telephone, we are now both actively and passively present everywhere on the planet.
I don't intend to sound dogmatic. All I'm doing is making observations which I think can be tested. I don't intend to merely assert them dogmatically. I mean to say that is an observation. You can test it. You can bounce the ball off it or do anything you like with it. But I'm merely testing. I'm putting it forward as an observation rather than as a concept. I don't tend to use concepts. I tend to use percepts. My own way of approaching the media is perceptual, not conceptual. That's why I'm not much interested in the content of the media. The medium itself is something that has to be perceived, to be understood. What you put into the medium is like what you say on the telephone couldn't matter less. The effect of the telephone is quite independent of anything you say on the telephone. And the same is true of radio, TV, and the printed word, too. The power of the printed word to shape your awareness has nothing to do with what you print. Anyway, that is a big clash in the minds of many people, to think that the content doesn't really matter. It hurts a lot of people, or it hurts their idea of what they think they are. But anyway, again, it's not something that I'm idealizing or proposing or promoting. I'm simply observing these situations, and all of my understanding media is an attempt to observe behaviors of these forms, not to try to conceptualize the forms.
Forgive my impertinence, but has anybody asked you why you are sometimes difficult to understand?
Because I use the right hemisphere when they're trying to use the left hemisphere.
Okay, well, I'll try and get back on the line.
So you see, that when the people ordinarily people are trained to try to follow you and to connect everything you say with what they last heard. They're not prepared to use their wits. They're only prepared to use the idea they picked up the first time and try to connect it to another idea. So if you're in a situation that is flexible, where you have to use your wits and perceptions, they can't follow you. They have preconceptions that phase them out at once. You see, that's left hemisphere. I use the right hemisphere a great deal, which is a world of perception, no concepts. I don't use any...
Got you. And you don't try to connect things, you just let the right hemisphere take over and let it go.
And watch what's happening. And so that is the way the cookie crumbles, sort of thing, where you don't know what's going to happen, but you follow the crumble.
In a time like this, where the written word and the spoken word through commercial media reaches millions of people with tremendous force, with the prestige of huge agencies of expression behind them, it seems above all important that intense training in language is demanded if the society is to retain its health.
We don't understand information movement and image making as warfare at all. We call this advertising. Actually, Medicine Avenue is a major military operation, vastly aggressive, and out to conquer empires, territories within the human heart, the human senses. It is a huge military operation of empire building and icon making. If we had the slightest consciousness of social responsibility, instead of just a sort of a private subconscious, totally inadequate to our technology, we would teach our children in our schools how to protect themselves against media fallout and advertising fallout. It's simply fantastic, the unconsciousness of our Western world with regard to the forces that we release upon it. And the little areas in which we permit ourselves any consciousness or responsibility are minute compared to the real areas of impact. Advertising is a vast military operation intended openly and brashly intended to conquer the human spirit. The critics of advertising miss the bus entirely by complaining about false claims. And nothing could be less important than the false claims in advertising. It is the total icon-making activity that matters. And in the degree that these men are icon makers, these agency men, they certainly have the right to call themselves creative artists. Whether they perform a good, benign social function is open to question, but as creators of tremendous effects, they are artists. Remember, an artist is primarily concerned with getting your attention. Whether he's a poet or a musician, his first wish and hope is to trap your attention. This is the first hope and wish of every advertiser. He is an artist certainly to that extent. He wants to shape your attention, to shape your sensibilities, to create an effect upon you. Whether you believe a word he says couldn't matter less to him. He is interested only in effects, and not in changing your opinions or thoughts about anything. And this is also true of a poet. Couldn't care less what you thought or felt about him or anything, as long as he gets his effect across.
Well, in modern advertising, there's much the same revolution going forward as has been going forward in painting and poetry and in the world of entertainment, with the audience moving more and more into the act. Modern advertising is more and more a substitute for the product. Because of its rich resources and means of sensuous solicitation, modern advertising can give you the effect of almost anything without your having to bother about having the thing at all. Tony Schwartz is in the audience tonight, and he is an expert in this very department. The power of giving effect without thinking is entirely within his domain. But you see, the advertisers have been puzzled for a long time in their surveys to discover that people don't really read ads until they own the thing. And if you own that icebox or that car, then you notice the ads very much, because this is how you get your satisfaction.
Well, Bob, I just wanted to say that certainly in McLuhan's view, the critique of satisfactions is what's coming into play now. And it's very upsetting because our society for a long time assumed that everybody knew that more and more people meant growth, and more buildings meant growth, and more money meant success. And more will not work at all at the speed of light. And more education is meaningless.
Well, under hardware conditions, those satisfactions were met, but under software conditions, new satisfactions arise. And I think he just explained that people want the effect, the image of a thing rather than the image, rather than the object itself. For example, one can get vastly richer colors on television today than you can in the supermarket or in the museum. But this would affect the marketing of food. Maybe that is why additives have been added the last 20, 30 years to add color, so the foods can mime the intensity and tactileness of the color effect of television.
Well, perhaps the most obvious consequence of any new technology is just the demand for it, because it's peculiar, but on the whole, nobody wanted a motor car until there are motor cars, and nobody is interested in television until there are TV programs. This power of technology to create its own world of demand, emperor-like,
is addictive.
Is not independent of technology, being first an extension of our own bodies and senses.
It's addictive. All technologies are addictive, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We thought advertising, we should have had a lot of ads in here because they're one of the most interesting forms of art of our time. The great folk art of the 20th century is advertising. It's folk art. Anonymous. Using all of the skills of the community, for good or ill, but using them all anonymously. 31.5 billion per annum. Paid largely to artists and media people. The greatest folk art of our time, an area requiring the utmost attention for students in schools. Not the claims of the product, but just simply the art forms that are being employed. One of the richest areas for the training of perception that exists. You know, if it went into the schools as a form of training, the advertisers would be out of business in no time, because their work is intended to be invisible. All advertising is deliberately designed not to be noticed. One of the first tests the ad agencies apply to an ad is, was it noticed? If it's so, it's a bad advertisement. They want the ad to be noticed 2 or 3 weeks later, after you've first seen it. It's called the Petzl effect, P-O-E-T-Z-L-E, or Z-L-E. The Petzl effect is called the psychological effect whereby the impact of something is delayed for 2 or 3 weeks. All advertisements they try to build them on that principle of delayed perception so that you will not begin to argue with the ad right off. You see, if you notice the ad, you're likely to fight it. You're likely to say it's bunk. There's not a word of truth in it. And the advertiser tries to avoid that reaction by hiding the ad. And so, anyway, this book, City as Classroom, the hidden ground of every classroom is the city. Today, the city has become a huge information resource. The classroom is a very minor educational resource. The city is a huge one. So we have devised, I had 2 collaborators on this book, we devised a series of projects that would enable students to go out in teams of 2 or 3 to investigate particular aspects of the city and to come back, discuss, and report in writing, have a written report too. So it's a study, it's an approach to the city, taking it out of the hidden ground effect and giving it salience as a huge learning resource. Because the modern city is founded on the knowledge industries. Everybody in the city goes to work to read from morning till night. Some go there. By the way, the word read, hidden ground, means to guess. Radon, in the OED, look it up. It means to guess. And one reason that you have to guess when you're looking at any word whatever is that it has dozens of meanings that are not being used at that particular moment. When you look up the word read, you'll find many columns of meanings for the word, and beside the word read, there's the word run, R-U-N. He who runs may read. Well, run means R-U-N-E. Run comes from rune, which means a cryptic puzzle. And reading and runing are close.
Okay, Chris, I'd like to suggest we've just talked about using the classroom, the city as a classroom. Marshall has suggested through the 60s that if teachers were serious about having their students appreciate the values of Shakespeare and most of our Gutenberg heritage, he recommended that they should test them on the comics and newspapers and TV shows that they see and experience every day, and as a result they would probably regard that as school, and in their rebellious spirit they would retrieve Shakespeare and the former sources of information and entertainment and uplift as a balance of this, just to be rebels. So he had a comic effect in his approach, and he claimed that if people were really serious, it may have sounded silly, the suggestion, but if people were really serious, they would be able to preserve their heritage for students if they took this strategy. And ads would be another thing. If the kids were tested on the ads they saw on TV that night or heard on the radio, the next day they would probably stop listening to the radio and TV. And this would be a necessary sensory balance, and it also would have access to a lot of people in the schools, because that's where most of the kids spend their time, rather than just working on your own family. The teachers have access to a lot of people.
An interesting question, sideline, on with regard to education that McLuhan asked is that to what extent is education really a service in a time when every kind of information is instantaneously accessible, whether by computer or some other medium, when every kind of learning is at one's elbow or ready to hand? What is the role of the schoolroom, originally designed to make learning available to those who couldn't otherwise reach it? And I think there were a lot of people who didn't know what to say to that.
Marshall also added the fact that all art, science, and philosophy are anti-environmental controls that are ever merging into the environmental and losing their power to create awareness of environment. When arts fail to cope with the environment by being anti-environment, then there can be a shift to a rapid succession of innovations as ersatz anti-environments.
And this is about what he said earlier about the artist working on the limits of perception, and what you're saying is that the lessons learned are superseded by the need for new perception. What do you mean, environments and anti-environments?
Certainly, because, our conventional response to all media, namely that it is how they are used that counts, is like the numb stance of the technological idiot. In fact, the effects of technology do not occur at the level of opinions or concepts at all, but instead alter, this is what you were talking about earlier, Chris, instead alter sense ratios or patterns of perception steadily and without resistance. And today, when you ask the meaning of electric technology, it's really that electricity is within our gates and we are numb and deaf and blind to it, and as a result have surrendered our senses and nervous systems to the private manipulation of those who would try to benefit from taking a lease on our eyes or ears or nerves.
I think the arts today are at best a guide to the sensory shifts, but they certainly have minimal effect compared to the sensory effect of whole environments, electrical or mechanical environments. These are taken over the role of the arts, traditional role of arts, which was enhancing perception. So what is the role of the artist, the traditional job of painter or sculptor or musician, when this role of shaping perception has been usurped by massive environments?
Certainly, it's no time to suggest strategies when the threat has not even been acknowledged to exist. How could anyone expect any individual to deduce alone the pattern of reality based upon a single perception of view at these high speeds of living, at the speed of light? And it's the role of the artist to keep people tuned to the present. So if you're going to tune their sensibilities and their perceptions, you have to constantly rearrange the focusing of their perceptions.
Does that make sense, Chris?
I was going to ask you, I don't know if you're going to say this till the end, but where do you think it looks like an evolution of technology. Where is that leading humankind? Where if we're extending our body through technology and allegedly affecting our perceptions, where is that leading?
Well, I think the hologram comes after television, but it's interesting that Marshall did say that the television was the end of man's creativity, the last environment. But let's hear some more, and then maybe think about that and talk later.
But reading as the art of guessing, very fast guessing, leads to fast decision making and leads to good executive work. So a good reader is automatically a good executive. He makes decisions very fast, and he who runes may read. But the fact that reading is guessing means that every word has a hidden ground of many, many layers. Under every single word you utter, the word utter is a very good example of this multi-level of hidden meanings. Every single word you use, whether it's cat or dog or whatever, has layer after layer of hidden meanings that are not used. But when you use the word, all of them are put into resonant activity. Whenever you use a word, it doesn't matter whether you know the meaning or not, the whole word is in resonant activity. It echoes. The totality of the word is put into action by just using it. You don't have to know what it means. You just hearing it is enough. And so this again is an example of the hidden ground as part of our ordinary perceptual lives. Now, under the conditions of electronic technology, the hidden acoustic ground of language has awakened enormously. Words are much more up in the level of consciousness than they ever were in many centuries, thanks to living in an acoustic age. The visual...
One of the things here, Chris, that you may want to keep in mind with regard to, again, the electric environment is that when you speed up the information movement in any environment, then the patterns become visible, and this happens in many fields today. For instance, the whole of human studies in many departments has switched to what is called structuralism. Instead of studying the classified content of situations, we now study the structures of situations themselves. And with the large rise of information levels, the tendency is for any one natural resource to become a substitute for any other. Anything can become fuel, and any fuel can become the fabric.
Visual man can suppress nearly all the meanings of a word. Highly literate person is offended when you pun using some other meaning of a word. He groans merely to hear the acoustic dimension of a word put into play. Young and easily frightened. Though he might have been more humble, there's no police like Holmes. James Joyce. I'm quoting him. From Finnegan's Wake. Now, though he might have been more humble, there's no police like Holmes is a very profound sociological treatise. It would take volumes to elucidate it. But Joyce is an example of the return of the oral tradition. And it was from Ireland. And as most of the poetry of our time comes from oral countries and in oral forms. But the city's classroom is using the city as a hidden ground and the classroom as figure, conscious level, and to explore the hidden level of the city as an activity. I have a friend who is a video journalist and who mentioned the other day that hijacking and kidnapping are very closely related. The reason that hijackers tend to kidnap people in our time is that the speed with which they can be apprehended gives them no escape route. The bank robber today can be caught so quickly that the getaway car is useless. So instead of trying a getaway, he grabs a hostage. The hostage is the result of improved communication. As we get faster and faster at grabbing the culprit, he becomes more and more violent and desperate in his strategy. So the video news people are very in two minds about, are we the cause of these hijackings? Should we stop reporting them? The answer is yes. They are the cause and they should stop. It is the reporting of the event itself that attracts most hijackers to go into the business. They just want the publicity. They usually carry whole bundles of hijacking stories with them in their wallets. One of their favorite forms of collection.
To show another effect of a new media and how overwhelming it can be and unnoticeable, would be to look at the quote of a famous filmmaker critic by the name of Bela Bellas, who in his theory of film noted how the discovery of printing gradually rendered illegible the faces of men. So much could be read from paper that the method of conveying meaning by facial expression fell into desuetude. Likewise today, until we learn the grammars of the newest media, we'll always fall into desuetude. As Lexi said, are you basing your point of view towards any, I guess you're not basing it towards a goal, but can you relate it to the ending of the society or the changing of society or very direct?
I'm pretty sure that when people see the pattern of things around them, then the thing is already cured.
Is there any way, okay, supposing that I have a revelation and I see it all. What can I do? To either make other people see it or what?
Look busy. I'll tell you a story. There's a guy having too many beers in a Dublin pub. And in the midst of his drinking, he suddenly sees the figure of Christ standing in the doorway of the pub. And he takes another belt of booze and looks again, and there he still is. So he backs slowly toward the telephone at the back of the pub, and he rings bat 69, the Pope's phone number. And he is so urgent and so convincing, they put him through to the Pope. And he says, I am here in Murphy's Bar, and I'm seeing the figure of Christ standing in the door. What shall I do? There's a pause, and a voice says, look busy. Look busy.
Well, there is the answer.
That is the answer.
Well, we've been listening to a special about Marshall McLuhan, and we're talking to Bob Marshall and his friend, colleague.
Well, what we've listened to is a number of different collage of McLuhan's in dialogue, and certainly we don't want to connect them all, but just have them resonating all at the same time. Certainly. One of the things that stands out is it reminds me of that Pierre Trudeau was a perpetual annoyance to the newspapermen because of his continuous efforts to understand processes and his avoidance of points of view or declarations of policy. Policies, he said, and points of view are goals and are fragmented features of the old mechanical world of the 19th century product orientation. McLuhan suggested that all possibility of understanding today stems from the breakdown of existing processes. He pointed to Albert Einstein in writing about the general history of gravitation theory, wondered whether Michael Faraday would have ever have discovered electricity if he had had the standard university education of his time. The first principle of operations research is to check out the experts.
Chris, you're on the air a lot at this station. Can you record any effects on yourself of having your image and voice broadcast over the city regularly during the week? Have you noticed, how do you see this affecting your social life, your personal life, or your financial life?
I don't see too many effects. I'm not a star radio person, but maybe you should ask someone on a professional station. Some effects people have talked about is having people recognize their voice. Don't that really it surprises them. Okay, but this never happened to me. Well, I don't see any effects of me being here because this is sort of a different type of setup.
Well, the fact is you're simultaneous. If you were writing letters to every member of the Toronto listening audience for CKLN, take a long time for each one of them to read that letter, right? But you see the difference in time and space to have access to these people immediately when you're on the air? quite a change.
Yeah, but if you don't get feedback, then you don't know about it. That's why.
Well, feedback.
That's why it's different. We're not. The feedback at a professional station would be the profit made by the amount of people listening, affecting how much they can charge for advertising. And since we don't have that here,
well, you do get feedback from your listeners via phone calls and requests.
Yeah, but not en masse, and it doesn't go to our heads or anything like that. No.
Okay, now maybe another reason.
I know the effect of radio, but it doesn't affect me personally.
Yeah, well, you're the man behind the scene. The environment is affecting its users, which I guess are everybody who's tuned into the radio. But what's interesting, the CKLN and the kind of programming it has does not offer a political threat when television and satellites are the newer environments and are changing our lives. So that I think that maybe the content of CKLN or any station, regardless of political or motives, would seem to be more of a pastime, wouldn't you think?
No, I disagree with you there. I think with our music programming, a way of life now is a political act, and we are supporting alternative lifestyles within a larger structure of society. And I would argue about music. Musical structures are political as well. And the lyrical content doesn't play so much a role anymore. Obviously, punk rock, when it started, aggressive music is political music, and there's just this level of aggression. So I would say our programming is political, whether the lyrics are political or not.
Wouldn't you say that the programming of CKLN offers community to people in Toronto, a sense of community, and access, a representative tone, has access to the air, the electric air, and therefore can be picked up and enjoyed as like a massive advertisement? Wouldn't that be the...
Yeah, that's growing now. I wouldn't say that exists right now. It's too much.
Well, but you know, some people...
It will be that way soon.
If your ratings go up quite high, then the kind of people who like to wear say, a more obscure community as an art form would go to or demand another station, wouldn't you say? Isn't that the fate?
Hopefully will be a viable system.
You remain...
evolving viable system, which would mean remaining at that alternative level and not following the corporate evolution into top 30 pop, like has happened at other formerly alternative stations.
Now, that would be the fate of merging with the computer, wouldn't it? Because those stations are run by computer, aren't they? They're programming lists. They organized out of the United States?
Not K stations, no. But obviously the musical industry is from, at the two FM rock stations, the industry is from the States. The other one is kind of a hybrid of European and American.
So this is a form of media ecology to put on the old environment of radio.
Well, the other stations are about programming, and we are not about programming here, so that is the key.
That's what I mean, is that you are offering a sense of community of diverse lifestyles, diverse opinions, different approaches, have access to a medium, whereas they don't have access to the major stations.
The important thing that McLuhan said with regard to the programming on radio is that the bias of each medium of communications is certainly far more distorting than the deliberate lie. And that's of interest when it comes to programming.
Chris, how do you, does one learn anything from hearing Marshall this past hour? Did you get some new ideas, or does it reinforce what you already feel? I'm interested in the effect of the information on you, since you haven't heard these tapes before.
Well, I've read his books, and I didn't hear anything new tonight, but nothing that I didn't know. One thing I think that he does, there's other areas that have to be combined with his information.
An example?
Well, to understand systems and how they operate, I would suggest Stafford Beer. And
the computer man.
Well, it's not really computers, it's systems. He was from systems theory, and he has a complete... he has, what the word for it is, I don't know, but it's a plan or a way of analyzing the various structures in the world and how they interrelate. That includes a spiritual thing, which I don't think... McLuhan is mostly mechanical observation, and he never put his... He was a Catholic, for instance. He didn't put that. Obviously, what you're saying before was that none of this was his opinion. He was just observing the system, but he could have at some point put his own opinion in. And I think there's an element, you combine his information with several other objective analysis of reality, that then you get a better picture.
A satisfying image of what's happening.
Yeah. One that involves the complete systems, not just the technological, that are at work in the world.
Though Marshall felt that we were in a situation where the word made the market, meaning that every man had the chance to be spiritually information. So he sort of had a parallel to Teilhard de Chardin's mythology of spiritualized noosphere, where man would communicate as information. But he did not like to emphasize the theological ramifications because he thought morality would be improved if we got rid of the moral judgments about technologies and their effects, and the very fact that they appear mechanical when we have moved into an organic reality under electronic speed of light or instantaneity, where everybody is in constant access to each other and has to react to each other. That is a technical expression of a spiritual condition or spiritual metaphor. Whether man can take that is another matter. And then we can maybe on another show talk about how or whether one should turn off the electric environment if it is too much for normal beings to take.
I'd like to thank you guys for coming down tonight.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks to CKLN.
Thank you, Chris. Shows that it was based primarily on one part of the traditional classical curriculum of the 7 arts, which consisted of rhetoric, grammar, dialectic or logic, music, astronomy, arithmetic, and geometry. Marshall studied rhetoric at Cambridge in the 1930s, rhetoric being the art of the effects of spoken language, and since he regarded man and all his activities as language, applied rhetorical knowledge to the new languages which were man's technological environments. In the process of this study, he used the psychiatric technique of the suspended judgment in a kind of corporate psychiatry of whole populations and peoples during their interactions with these massive environments. However, on page 273 of the Gutenberg Galaxy, he reveals that, quote, a few decades hence, it will be easy to describe the revolution in human perception and motivation that resulted from beholding the new mosaic mesh of the TV image. Today, it is futile to discuss it at all, unquote. This was written in 1962, so it should be realized that Marshall had at least 20 years to play with his study of media and their audiences, and that's why he satirized the global audience of this revolution and its effects, including his own audience, as a parallel activity among many in his global theater role as the director of the Center for Culture and Technology. Okay, Chris, let's play.
Well, at the speed of light, there is no time or space.
Today we have a special word of mouth. We're going to be talking about Marshall McLuhan for the next hour, hearing special lectures that he has given. And today I have 2 special guests, Bob Marshall and someone who will remain anonymous. Take it away, gentlemen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen listeners. This evening I'm in dialogue with the Chief Archivist of the Marshall McLuhan Center at Toronto, Mr. Bob Marshall. May I, on behalf of our listeners, say that we have been looking forward to tonight's sharing of ignorance, Bob. Business at the beginning of the show. Of course, no show of less than an hour could ever explain any one person, let alone Professor Dr. McLuhan. To tame tonight's Herculean task is merely to say that we intend to play for our listeners and students as much of McLuhan in dialogue as is possible. Parenthetically, students are reminded to ignore everything but the hidden ground of perception so important to the work of Professor McLuhan.
In short, nothing we say or play during this hour will be as significant as the fact we're using the medium of radio at this time. The simplest and quickest way to summarize Marshall's approach used in his 22 books and 522 articles and essays would be to point out that
You're just space-time. And literally, when the telegraph came in, the space and time intervals between peoples were pulled out. That was shortly followed by Cubism, which pulled out the space intervals in painting. And the visual connections in painting were pulled out by the Cubists. I'm always insisting upon the artist as the sort of heralds of technological change. And as a matter of fact, we've worked on this quite a bit. Art in general gives you about a generation, at least a generation of warning or notice in advance of technological change. The art forms themselves will take on characteristics that really belong to something that has not been invented yet or hasn't surfaced yet. Seurat and Rouault were painting television long before television. The Seurat pointillism uses little dots, undiscontinuous dots, with light dots, with light coming through the picture at you. And that's 1880, long before TV. Where there's no oral tradition, there is no basis for jazz or rock. But that's another subject. That's a hidden, but what I'm drawing attention to here is that there's a hidden ground that makes possible any technological change.
Well, I think we'll take it momentarily from there. Certainly, if you, Bob McLuhan believed that the role of the artist is to keep people tuned to the present. And if you're going to tune their sensibilities, then you have to constantly rearrange the focusing of their perceptions.
Yes. How's it sound to you, Chris?
Well, guys, I was trying to fix some things here. I can't really... I missed that first one. I'll have to continue.
The message.
All right, let's continue.
Let's continue.
There's another factor, hidden factor in music, that the sounds of the environment are filtered through the language in order to create music. What is called music, whether it's Italian, German, or others, is the sounds of the human environment, technological sounds of the environment, being filtered through the language or transformed in the language. The language is the metamorphic power that creates music. So you can't, German music has in general, the Cubists were not that far ahead of the telegraph, that's sure. But symbolism, which also pulls out the connections in poetry, was certainly part of the telegraph. Because the instantaneous forms of communication that came into the telegraph permitted a sort of simultaneous acoustic character, and it was exactly that which Edgar Allan Poe, the Southerner, latched onto in poetry. Poe became the sort of avant-garde of French symbolism. Baudelaire was the first to really understand Poe and to adapt him to French use. But Poe, the Southerner, the oral tradition man, is as significant a figure from that point of view as anybody. Another peculiarity from the South in that regard is, of course, that rock and roll and jazz all come out of the Deep South and could not possibly have come from Boston or Chicago, because there's no oral tradition there to hold them up. Jazz and rock are acoustic forms that do not depend on a written culture. And where there is no oral tradition, and there is no oral tradition in the industrial North,